welcome to the Akademisk Boldcast, the official Akademisk Bold Club podcast, in which we dissect the team's latest performances in the Bold Breakdown, explore the individual insights of the playing, coaching, and executive personnel through exclusive interviews in the Owl's Nest, plus look ahead at the team's calendar and provide a preview of its future foes in the look ahead. I am your host, Sean Cabrera, and it is my pleasure to be discussing AB's development throughout its 2025-2026 campaign with you, especially now that we find ourselves in the midst of the winter break, halfway through the overall season of the Danish second division. Now, you could argue that Akademisk Bold Club's journey to the top of the Kampelbet and Division table at the time of this recording did not have a true start until match week 2 due to the inclement weather eventually postponing its first week fixture involving Ishøj Idrætsforening to mid-August. Although Akademisk Bold Club, with a belated home field advantage to start its league ventures, had entered the season, let alone this match week 2 affair against Football Club Helsingør, as the favorite to win everything, its journey was not off to sunshine and rainbows. In fact, it physically and metaphorically started with the rainy day. FC Helsingør, the Danish team co-owned by Andrés Iniesta, the legendary Spanish midfielder, whose resume makes a fair case for him to be labeled an all-timer in his position, retained a seat at the Danish second division table after barely surviving the 2024-2025 rendition of the competition. Now, for context here, barely surviving means that this club had ultimately finished in third to last place in the relegation group of the postseason phase, which means that it hovered above relegation to the third division by just 2 points. Now, this club's circumstances sound more shocking when you realize that the team finished 3 first division regular seasons in a row as a top 4 competitor, only for it to plummet from that pedestal in its 4th consecutive campaign. In summary, Helsingør nearly suffered a second straight relegation after years of being labeled as a solid first division contender that consistently competed for promotion to Denmark's top flight, the Superliga. It was a sudden collapse, in other words. Meanwhile, your guys in green, the AB players, since 2017, like the Bruno Mars song, have been locked out of heaven, unable to ascend to the first division despite qualifying for the promotion round in all but one season throughout that span. In response, Akademisk Bold Club's scouting staff had made astute acquisitions during the 2025 summer transfer window, including but not limited to B93's promisingly talented forward Jonathan Mattis, Teasel's homegrown 6'3" striker Markus Emerson, Skew's now ex-captain and midfield overseer Marco Vesterholm, 6'5.5" colossus between the sticks and former member of Iceland's U21 squad Adam Benediktsson, and a returning Superliga winning defender with now 17 years of professional experience, Mark Delhinde. Again, a decent multitude of signings during the last transfer window, and the one before that, in other words, the winter transfer window, but taking into account the playing and perhaps psychological contributions these players have had on the squad throughout this season's progression, it's important to give them, as well as the scouting staff, some credit. Joey Gudjonsson, former Premier League and La Liga midfielder in his sophomore season as AB head coach, decided that the squad would commence its first full league game with a 4-3-3 formation, which saw all those aforementioned acquisitions, except Mattis, in the starting lineup. Identical to the one in that postponed match week 1 scheduling, of course. After some surprisingly heavy rain in the first handful of minutes, remember what we talked about, the rest of the first half was replete with countless offensive opportunities that somehow did not result in goal from the Akademiks. Ovante Mullings outsmarting a defender and delicately squeezing the ball past the keeper in the 6th minute, only for it to be cleared right before he could wrap it around the near post. Ovante blasting a half volley from 20 yards out in the 21st minute that resulted in some goalkeeping intervention. A Kasper Koenig through pass to Marcus Emerson inside the 6-yard box in the 33rd minute, which resulted in another piece of goalkeeping intervention due to a heavy first touch, a no-look redirection attempt from an unmarked Ayrjal Jonasson from a deviated corner kick in the 36th minute that bounced off target, and just a minute later, Marcus Emerson with a clear-cut breakaway thanks to 2 first-time passes, which allowed him to beat the back line off the ball that also barely crawled wide. So what was the halftime score? 0-0, 0-0. It was a scoreless first half. Now these chances from the double-digit quantity of the first half are specifically mentioned because they're opportunities that seldom reappear. Admittedly, some scenarios simply ended in respectable defensive and goalkeeping actions from the visitors, but others were costly misses. The Akademiks displayed some off-the-charts ingenuity and great control of the field's final third, but their inadequate finishing played a notorious role. In hindsight, this was part of the Owls' growing pains, considering that they are now the highest scoring team in the competition, but you could argue that this performance served as a catalyst, resulting in that attacking improvement. Meanwhile, Helsingør's only true shot in the period came from a backline misplay within the AB box. If it weren't for Benediktson's reactions or anticipatory abilities, in this case I'm referring to his ability to instantly read the giveaway rather than the save itself, which would be better described as a charging, splayed-out low block, it would have been a silly conceded goal due to Helsingør's notable lack of possession up until that 12th minute. Even then, the visitors' attacking strategy throughout the contest became more clear as the second period progressed. High pressing, forcing the defenders into committing mistakes, and eventually, they struck gold 5 minutes into the second half when a floated ball about 10 yards in front of the penalty area was sent farther up, or technically backwards, by a Del Hende header who had intended to tap the ball toward a friendly center back. The forward was perfectly situated in front of the back line before that ball hit the ground and, within the penalty arc, struck it to the far post for the opening score. 2 minutes later, AB's unusual attacking shape in the opposing half, almost resembling a 2-4-2-2, left the flanks completely open when the opposing left back's clearance turned into a lobbed through pass that the left winger carried from the halfway line to the penalty area, and his tight-angled left-footed effort 99 times out of 100 would have ended up in Benediktson's arms, but this just happened to be one of that odd one, I should say, that resulted in the sphere slipping past his mitts and beyond the goal line. Afterward, still 2 goals down within the final quarter hour, head coach Gudjonsson decided to implement a 4-2-4 formation to put the pressure on the visiting back line, and several shots later, plus another Benediktsson starfish save, a chaotic lob resulted in substitute Spacey Hailtom touching the ball just softly enough so that Captain Del Hende could slither past 2 markers and slot it to the far post's bottom corner for a 2-1 scoreline. Seconds, and I do mean seconds later, Steven Balla, who entered this match as a substitute, booted one from the left central side from give or take 26 yards away, only for it to slide wide by no more than a foot. Several tactical fouls and yellow cards by Helsingør later, the visitors emerged exhausted, but with all 3 points in Gladsaxe Stadion of all places after more than 7 minutes of stoppage time. And some of the stats really do tell the story here. 6 of 20 AB shots were on target in comparison to the 7 of 15 from Helsingør, and for those who like the expected goals stat, which practically means how many goals a team should have had based on the historic metrics and averages of similar shots, Akademisk Boldcast had 1.72, whereas FC Helsingør had 1.26, which confirms that AB should have scored more goals by the raw numbers. All this just goes to show that the Akademiks suffered the same exact problems seen in the first half. First-class build-up play, but underwhelming finishing, unable to register more shots on target than its opponent, but worst of all, squandering vital chances, something that would gradually disappear throughout the first quarter of the campaign as it slowly transformed into the league's most efficient offense. This defeat also goes to show the level of competition where anything topsy-turvy can happen. Present-day Helsingør sits at the bottom of the standings, yet this was the team that snapped present table topper AB's 9-game undefeated streak across all official competitions in that instant. Before we jump into the club's second league match, the Bold Breakdown has been brought to you by Myriad 360, a trusted global IT solutions partner for high-growth tech companies and enterprise innovators, delivering best-in-class solutions across cybersecurity, modern data center, networking, cloud, and AI. Visit myriad360.com for a complimentary strategy session. Speaking of 360s, let's go back to AB's start of its journey. It's also a statistical anomaly for an eventual domestic league winner to lose the season opening affair. If we take a look at a couple top flight leagues, just for the sake of the argument, again, this is beyond Denmark, we're looking at 2 top 5 leagues in Europe, we'd see that only one Premier League club had won the whole thing after losing its season opener. I'll give you 5 seconds to guess which team in the Premier League had done it. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Now, if you guessed Manchester United, you'd be absolutely correct because that happened on 3 occasions in the 1990s. And when we take a look at the Iberian Peninsula, specifically Spain, and its top division, otherwise known as La Liga or La Primera División, we see that 2 clubs had won theirs under the same circumstances. Real Madrid 5 times between the 1930s and the 1970s, plus FC Barcelona in that 2008-2009 run. Yet, here we are, in the middle of the winter break, and Akademisk Boldcast rests at the peak of the Danish second division mountain. So how did it get its first points of the season? We just have to look no further than the following weekend when it encountered Brabrand Idrætsforening, a side that regained entry to this competition thanks to its successful silverware-producing third division undertaking. Brabrand, in the 2023-2024 Danish second division rendition, found itself at the bottom of the pecking order and was relegated after being the only side incapable of generating 27 or more points. BIF, however, rebounded instantly, so it's not truly a new face to the league itself, but it's still noteworthy in that regard. The Akademiks, who last played this opponent almost 2 years ago, went into the contest knowing very well that Brabrand's rather physical style would require them to play with an equally creative system that prioritized, I suppose, quickness rather than meticulous construction or overly dominant possession. Luckily, they have just the asset for that. Ovante Mullings, the 2024-2025 Akademisk Boldcast player of the season, that got himself involved on the scoreboard 23 minutes into the outing when Miguel Brun strongly headed a ball from his half of the pitch to that of the opposition, which allowed the Canadian to sprint about 40 yards with the ball and punish BIF with just 4 deft touches. With a goal like this, we see the genesis of some of those lightning-fast scoring sequences in later games. Nothing too fancy, just cold-blooded efficiency and pace. Taking into account AB's quick keep-away strategy, Brabrand decided to make the most of its chances, especially from outside the box, with shots on target from this range, as well as crosses, the latter which resulted in that excellent equalizer. A short throw-in gave the recipient just enough space to whip one into the penalty area, eventually connecting with a decisive diving header. For those who have been consistently following the team, despite the various headed goals and lofted through passes we've seen, you might recall that the team spent its initial fixtures figuring out the defensive aspect to its aerial duel situations. In this match, the team was unsuccessful in nearly 60% of its aerial scenarios. Sure, you could argue that this problem slightly resurfaced before the winter break, but it would also be unfair to not mention the improvement in between at least. Returning to the action, the Akademiks almost returned the favor with a similar execution just a minute later, but solid goalkeeping kept the match tied at halftime. Smartly, Coach Gudjonsson made little adjustments during the break, noticing that the speedy style of the attacking midfielders in that 4-3-3 shape that liked to change every now and then into a 4-2-3-1 bewildered the rather spread out back line of 5 from Brabrand. Minutes into the second half, we also saw the origin of Vesterholm's architectural style when he managed to ping a wide early cross to an unmarked Kasper Reining, whose attempt was parried away by the keeper at his near post. Reining, however, was adamant on not making the same mistake twice when he capitalized on a far post tap-in thanks to Avante Mullings going full throttle into the penalty area in the 55th minute. On the other side of the field, Adam Benediktsson would remain firm inside his own 6-yard box, reassembling his defense and notably halting outside the box shots. As time went on, Brabrand played with more desperation and, by default, aggression. AB, in the meantime, played with tranquility thanks to its monopolization of the field's widths, producing several offensive opportunities and drawing fouls that killed precious seconds through extended periods of possession in the middle and attacking thirds. The referee finally blew the whistle after 7.5 minutes of stoppage time for the 2-1 full-time result, the first AB win of this league's rendition. Even though celebrations were in fact in order, Coach Gudjonsson level-headedly highlighted the insufficient finishing, noticing and noting that at least 2 first-half goals should have been scored. Again, that is a quote with a little bit of brackets there. And he also implied that his squad would need to improve its collective ability of capitalizing on the created chances. To the vexation of future opponents down the line, Gudjonsson ensured that this issue was more than just fixed. He planted the seeds for AB's sturdy front line with these statements. Speaking of upcoming statements, with the bold breakdown now complete, let's flock to the Owl's Nest with our first ever guest on this platform, sporting director Chang, who has had this role since 2022 and has naturally seen this roster develop over the years. This inaugural interview in the Owl's Nest has been brought to you by Datum. The secret of every hyperscale cloud is a laundry list of capabilities most builders have never heard of. Datum is on a mission to unlock these internet superpowers and help 1,000 new clouds thrive in the age of AI. Learn more at datum.net. Mr. Chang, firstly, allow me to thank you for being here and for being our first ever interviewee on the official Akademisk Boldcast podcast. We have to ask, how have you been during this winter break?
Good. We're just preparing to get ready for the spring to resume. Obviously, it's the transfer window, so there's lots of business being done around the league. But we're trying to just keep things the same and keep the core together, and we plan to go into spring with minimal change.
So it sounds like there's going to be similar tactics perhaps going into the second half of this Danish regular season of the second division, naturally. So we are expecting, again, those similar names, as you say. However,
professional athletes in select circumstances need to have limited memory, even though these players will be reappearing, as you say. I want to go back to that first game. Of course, you remember that season opening defeat versus Helsingør after the first match versus Ishoi was delayed, of course, postponed to mid-August. How did that defeat versus Helsingør influence later results at the individual and collective levels, including that subsequent win at Brabrand?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about sports is obviously it can be quite unpredictable. Anytime you take human capital into play and you add, mental aspects, things can be unpredictable. Obviously, going into the season, we had very sort of defined ways in terms of how we wanted to play. And so when we look at individual games, we're measuring the underlying performance, not necessarily just the result. You can't go into every game expecting it to win and then acting like it's in the world if it's not a win. So for us, the performance at Helsingør, obviously, we lost that game because of, some individual mistakes we made as a team. But the underlying performance in general was in line with what we expected, which was to dominate play, create lots of chances, attack relentlessly, and obviously, unfortunately, that particular game didn't work out. But you can't get emotional and judge things on a week-to-week basis. You have to look at the big picture. So I think for the squad, it obviously was not something we expected, but this is a strong group mentally, and we saw in the games after that they didn't really carry that defeat forward with them into the other games. So.
Now, you said the word big picture here, and that's going to be maybe the key word, especially, of course, with this being the pilot episode itself and pilot interview. I think I would like to extend that big picture into the general front line, the vanguard of Akademisk Boldcast that we've seen throughout this season. And like you said, in match week 1, lots of chances were created. However, we do have to recognize the fact that a lot of those chances were not completed. They weren't able to fulfill basically their destiny of scoring those goals, hence the frustration, I would imagine, in the locker room. So I guess this will be a two-part question, but let's start with the first one. What were the locker room feels and scenes like following that defeat?
Yeah, like I said, when you have a group that's mature and with strong mentality, yeah, they're obviously going to be disappointed, but they're not going to carry that into the next game. As a player, in our sport, you have to just take a next play mentality, and obviously, what's happened has happened. You learn from it and you move on. It's not something you can carry into the next game and let it affect that performance. At the end of the day, we're a very defined way that we want to play, and the players know and are comfortable with the way we play. And as long as we follow our principles of play and maintain the same philosophy, then in the overall picture, things will hopefully work out the way we expect.
I guess that goes hand in hand then with the second part question, because again, really the big problem was the finishing. And we saw that throughout the first weeks of the campaign where Akademisk Boldcast was involved in low scoring games, and if not low scoring games, at least tightly contested games where no more than one goal basically determined some of those fixtures. So going back to that, did that game, would you agree with the sentiment, if that game had a massive influence, especially in the, let's say, the second half of the first half of the season, considering that now Akademisk Boldcast is the leading goal scorer essentially amongst all the rosters of the Danish second division?
Right. I mean, actually, we were the leading goal scorers in the second half of the season before this season. So we've been on a good offensive trend for 12 months now. I think if you look at the sort of first 5 to 6 games of this past season, we had a lot of guys out injured. We going into the season, our projected starting forward line, the attacking four players, that three up top, the four players, the two strikers and two wingers, we didn't actually ever field that lineup. We had a lot of injuries, and so credit to the young guys that we brought in. They stepped up, but obviously they were still learning the dynamics and the relationships on the field with the other players. And so it was just a matter of gelling. And obviously in the second half of the fall, most of the injured guys came back, and then you just saw a tremendous uplift because you had the new guys that integrated by then. Then you had the original projected starters coming back. So it just coalesced at the same time. But I don't think, yeah, we were still scoring goals in the first 6 games. We just weren't scoring as many as we had expected. But again, we look at the underlying play, and the underlying play is very good. As long as you're creating chances, yeah, that's the most important thing, because scoring goals in football comes and goes, as even the big teams in the big leagues find, is that it's not something you can consistently rely on, is to score a lot of goals. It's what we're doing isn't common to score as many goals as we have. So overall, I'm just very pleased with the offensive direction of the team.
So from what it sounds like, at the same time, you can say that Akademisk Boldclub, even though we know that this side has a relentless front line, maybe the true weapon at the end of the day is the squad depth. Of course, that has been a theme throughout the season. And I suppose that also goes hand in hand with this follow-up question, because you, as sporting director, were clearly very busy during the 2025 summer itself.
Mhm.
So how did that all manage together, having to make all these signings with the likes of Jonathan Mattis, Marcus Emerson, re-signing Mark Delhenda back to the team, making his first appearance in over a
Mhm.
decade, essentially? How did that all pan out?
Yeah, I mean, the thing with transfers is, obviously, there are going to be some situations where you can't control, where some players leave the team, um, even if the team doesn't want them to leave, or unexpectedly, or they get an offer they can't refuse, or the team can't refuse. So you have to deal with all those situations. I mean, the main thing is that we have a consistent recruitment policy of the type of player that we want to bring in. Um, it's not always possible to bring in those kind of players, but when you have that opportunity, you have to try to take it. So if you look at the players we bring in, they all sort of fit a type of style of play, and they have certain physical characteristics that suit that style of play. And the main thing we want our players is, we want players who are brave. We want players that are willing to challenge people one-on-one, offensively, and challenge people defensively one-on-one. And that's not a style of play that every player is comfortable with, but the players that play for us, they are comfortable with that, and those are the type of players that we have to find. And so, we've been very fortunate that a lot of the players that we brought in the last year and a half, really suit our style of play, um, and enjoy our style of play, which is what attracted them to come to us in the first place.
It's fair to say that before the start of this 2025-2026 season, there were high expectations with respect to how this journey would unfold. And like you said, you Akademisk Boldclub, you again as sporting director, made sure that players that were not only liking the style of AB, but those that would also adapt nicely to the style of AB would be a member of this active roster. As sporting director, what so far has separated this season from others?
Yeah, I think it's been an evolving process. Talent wise, this is our third full season with the club since the new ownership took over. And I think all 3 seasons we've had, on paper, very talented teams. This team in particular, I think, has gelled really well off the field. Um, you know, the whole chemistry issue with teams is, it's very hard to perfect that. You have to get a group of guys that are willing to work together, make sacrifices. We have guys on our team that would start for a lot of other teams, but for us, they don't always start. But everybody has an important role to play. But to find a team where everybody gets on and is willing to make their sacrifices for each other, that's really hard to find that chemistry. So when you have a squad like that, which is what I think we have, then it's important to try to preserve that identity within the locker room. And so I think that's the biggest difference for us right now compared to past seasons, is that this is a group that really gets on together and works hard together.
Would you be in accordance with the idea that Akademisk Boldklub having the fourth oldest roster in the Danish second division, if that had anything to do with that establishment of chemistry?
No, actually, no, because I mean, it's two things. I mean, when you look at our squad age, but then you look at the average age of the starting lineup. The average age of the starting lineup for most of the four is actually very young, because some of the older players that skew the average up were actually either injured or not playing. So, I think in most of our games, we didn't have anyone older than 26 in the starting lineup, and most of the players in the lineup were between ages 20 and 22. So, um, yeah, the average age of the squad as a whole, as opposed to the average age of the starting lineup, is a little skewed. So
Fair enough. That's why we talked to you. You're the sporting director, so you're giving us the specific insight as to, all this assets, I suppose, or facets that can affect chemistry. And I suppose, oh, go ahead.
definitely important. It's definitely important to have experience in the squad because you need that for when things are not going quite as well. For younger players, um, they can be quite emotional at times. I'm not saying our players specifically. I mean in general. And then that's when you need the sort of older, wiser heads to sort of show them, or talk to them and calm them down or set the tempo. We have a group of guys that love to attack and, they love to go forward. And so, there are times where you need to control the game a little bit more and rein them back, as it were. So, you just do need that experience. But it's also you'll have some teams, and again, it's not nothing to do with us, but in general, you'll have some teams where there's a divide between the older players and the younger players. But as I say, on our team, everybody gets on along really well, so we don't have that issue. But I'm not going to take credit for the chemistry of the team. I mean, that's the guys. That's credit to the guys themselves. They are really top guys in terms of their mentality and their professionalism. And we do our background checks and research into players before we sign them, and we only try to sign players that we think are good human beings and will have the right mentality. But again, until you put them all together and see the effect, you don't really know. But right now, I would say this is probably the best group we've had in terms of overall mentality. We don't really have anybody who's not putting the team forward first, and that's what you really want to get to.
That nicely re-answers that question earlier about what has separated this season from others. The overall mentality of this roster, especially with the new signings, and you could say a young squad in general, when we're not looking at the full roster, but looking at game by game rosters and squads themselves. It seems like there's some underlying weapons there that other opponents, of course, in the Danish second division, cannot or will not account for, just simply because those are mental factors, as you say.
Yeah, for sure. As I say, we're a very energetic team. We like to attack, and we want to really just put the pressure on the other team for 90 minutes as much as possible.
And that's very often the case, especially when we go into next week's episode. But of course, I don't want to deliver any spoilers here. So Chang, thank you very much for spending your time here, for being the very first interviewee on this official Akademisk Boldcast podcast.
All right, thanks. Appreciate your time.
Once again, I'd like to send my thanks to Sporting Director Chang for sharing some interesting insight in the Owl's Nest. Now that we've discussed match weeks 2 and 3, our next episode will focus on the delayed first week face-off involving Ishøy Idrettsforening and that nail-biting tussle against Tisdel Fodboldklubb. After going undefeated twice in the same week against Famel Amma, winning in the Danish Cup and tying in league play, but offensively unable to do much against a newly demoted from the first division opponent, Ishøy challenged an AB side that from the attacking perspective also had a lot to prove. And speaking of challenges, dark horse gone powerhouse Tisdel intended on extending its undefeated streak of 8 to 9 official games when it encountered a mid-table AB in the fourth Campobet and Demichon match week. And that's been your look ahead, sponsored by Plane. Simple, intelligent, extensible. Plane.so offers modern project management for all teams. Go to plane.so to learn more. And tune in next time to hear what went the Akademiks' way and what they needed to improve from those matches, especially from the defensive standpoint. Of course, I have been Sean Cabrera, and thank you for listening to the very first Akademisk Boldcast episode. See you in the next one. Ciao, ciao for now.